Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, hosted by Natuvian with our guest speaker from SAP, Tobias Keller, product manager for UI logging and field masking. Today, he'll go over a detailed presentation and a live demo. Okay. And first, we hand over, I just want to give a short introduction of who Natuvian is and what connects us on this topic of data security with SAP. We're working with SAP for several years as a gold partner, and together we work in a co-innovation program to build services in privacy and protection. We're recognized experts in security, transformation, industrial processes, and we also specialize in implementing the requirements of GDPR and have run over 100 workshops for leading companies around the world that help them find a solution for GDPR compliance. Here you can see just an overview of some of the services we offer for GDPR, and that includes what we're going to go over today with UI logging and field masking implementation. This webinar today is part of our data privacy and protection series, and we'll cover two areas within the fields of action listed here. If you have any questions about other topics, feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to give you more detailed information. So these are the two areas that we're going to cover today. And before I hand over to Tobias, Mr. Keller, I just want to note, let everybody know, if you want to ask a question, that in your panel you can see there's a question section. So feel free to type your questions and we'll answer them at the end. Now I'll hand over to Tobias Keller, who may also introduce himself and tell us about you.
Thank you very much, Juliana. I'll share my screen shortly. Few words to me, Tobias Keller. I'm the product manager of UI logging and field masking to SAP solutions in the area of the sub-part called Innovative Business Solutions, IBSO, which is basically the new name for the part you may have known as custom development until last year. I've been with SAP for the last 10, 11 years as a consultant, initially as an architect for mobility, and since 5 years back, I took over UI logging and masking as a product owner, product manager, and in this role, talking to you today, hope the experience is enough to give you a good overview of what we are doing and why this is relevant for you and your business. Talking about UI logging masking, just as a short background, we are of course talking about data protection in general, where I say data protection coming from the threat to data security. There's two vectors to that. One is well, more internally driven, because your system of course contain a lot of business critical information that you would rather not have in the hands of your competition or somebody who has no access to it, because this may pose a risk to your organization. So it's business critical, it's a commercial motivation to protect sensitive data from being stolen. That's one part. We've heard that a little bit more in the past from our customers. Recently, we have a strong surge, of course, in requests for data protection concerning not so much the protection of data from theft, but protection of persons and of the person rights to their own data. That's the political motivation behind most of the legal requirements and compliance requirements in globally in legal systems, and most strongly currently in the GDPR area, the European General Data Protection Regulation. Just a few words on that one. I expect that most of you would have a background. Otherwise, the Natuvian series is also having a lot of information on that one. Please feel free to contact Natuvian in case you need more information on that. But as just said, the main target or the main idea behind this regulation is protecting individuals against their data being used without their knowledge or against their consent. And there's a lot of stipulations linked to it. It's a quite lengthy article stipulating a lot of things, among others, data minimization by default, by design, in order to make sure that not more than the really required amount of personal information is being touched at all, processed at all. Now you can discuss lengthily about the idea of being processed. For us, basically, it means anytime you touch the data, even viewing the data is being, they're being processed in the system. There's more stipulations about an organization's right to keep data, to store data that must be linked to a good reason and is also defined how long it may be. There are legal requirements behind it, how long data must be held. Now there are rights of persons to claim that the data be removed. That's a nice contradiction to some point that will be excellent to solve. And also the idea that data, when they're not required anymore, or there is the will of a user and his data, that these data must be destroyed. There's also requirements of a right to know. So you as an organization are required to tell a user, or sorry, not a user, one of your customers, basically what data about him you store, why you have that, how it's being used. And it will be interesting to also see whether there will not be requirements to find out who actually accessed those data and what he did with them in the worst case. That's exactly the area that we're going to talk about today. One big stipulation from my perspective is the stipulation of a notification to the authorities within 72 hours in case of a data abuse or data theft case. In case personal information is being involved, that's also a very big challenge. We'll hear later on what we think we can do exactly in this area. And of course, one of the direct stipulations that probably most have heard and probably everybody has already executed is to name a data protection officer. So a person who is responsible towards the authorities, but also inside the organization to make sure that the data protection regulation is being adhered to. It is all very nice and has been in place mainly even before, especially for Germany and some other areas. But the new part here maybe is more the penalty side, because penalties are supposed to be quite stiff. They are supposed to be meaningful, but also still in line with the worth of data. It's the question, how much is data protection worth? Now, there's a new price tag to that, which is very high. And also there's personal liability of management in case of willful intent or negligence in case of data leaks occurring. That just as a general background, when we talk about logging and masking, we are touching not the normal threat vector. When you think about data theft, quite often people have hackers in their mind, technically very, very clever people who manage to get into systems and do whatever they like. No, we are more targeting people who are normal stock, people like you and me, the users in your system, who by design of their roles and of their tasks must have access to specific data. That's why they have users in the system. They have access to transactions, applications in the system. They have all the good reasons to access particular data, and you can't just keep them out of a transaction because otherwise they can't do their work anymore. And exactly this case, it's very hard to find if somebody in such a position is abusing his or her authorization and is trying to jeopardize data and abuse data. It's a big problem. Such a user or such a source can, of course, stay in the system for a long time, which is another of the problems. They are very hard to detect, and they're also very hard to fight against. So it's very hard to protect you and your systems against this kind of threat. And again, particularly in this area, we have positioned the two products we have. We see the insider threat as something that can be approached in two steps. The first one is very much in line with standard stuff that's available in SAP. If somebody is not entitled or doesn't have a business need to see specific data, access specific data, well, he should just not have the access, right? So that is what's being done on transaction level, on application level within SAP by default. However, there is a huge area where, for instance, once you are in a transaction, because you need access to the transaction, quite often you have little or no additional means to further limit and detail out what is really required for the user to see. That means in a transaction with dozens or hundreds of fields of data, you see everything while you only need some. And some of the things you do not need as a user are clear to you. So this is certainly not data security by design, and also certainly not by default. And that's exactly where your masking kicks in, because we allow for a more granular approach, a configurable approach, to define which particular fields are critical. And on top of your existing system of authorizations, build a parallel system that defines also, even if I have access to a transaction or an application, which additional information inside that transaction shall be masked, shall be protected against being viewed. So by that, you by default decrease the potential amount of data that can be stolen. You decrease the amount of people who may be suspected to stealing data in case they got it, because it's just you keep the data distribution to a minimum. So everybody sees just what he sees, and each data object is only being seen by as many people as are really required. If the setup is right, that promises a lot of benefit. Now, masking out data and keeping them away from users is a powerful approach. If it can be used, if it can be defined clearly, it's a very strict one. But you also have to imagine, if you mask out too much, if you prohibit too much access, then people may be hindered in their efficiency, in their flexibility to take over tasks which are not of their normal of their normal role. In the worst case, you completely bring your organization to a halt. Yeah, that would probably need a lot of masking. But in those cases where information must be available, the approach is a different one. Basically, you would say, if data must remain openly available, well, you can't mask, but you still want to have some kind of control over it. So the normal way to achieve such a control, or to a certain amount at least, is to protocol the access, to create the data foundation to identify and prove if people do something wrong. So you keep data accessible, you lock the access, you can analyze that, and by this analysis, find out your best action. So identify basically what happens, and based on that, think about your best strategy, how to work it out. Such a scenario like logging, I think it's commonplace. There's a lot of logging instances all over SAP systems and all other IT systems as well. What is novel about UI logging is that we provide a generic approach and a coherent approach over, I would say, the most important SAP user interface technologies. So we provide that for SAP GUI, of course, for other legacy technologies like Web Pro App, that's portal scenarios, master data management, Web Client UI, which is the proprietary UI for CRM, SAP CRM systems. But also we provide some technical interfaces, RFC BAPI's web services for machine-to-machine communication, as well as business warehouse access. So download from business warehouse, where of course a lot of data resides and can potentially be abused, because the technical tools are there to retrieve and download mass data easily. On top, of course, the strategic UI technology of UI5 Fiori is also being covered, both with logging and masking. Now, if you do such a logging, then your benefit is, of course, as soon as users know that the access and the actions can be logged, we get back as a feedback from the market, from our customers, that the behavior of users tends to change. They would be more considerate in what they access, in what cases they do have a reason to access. So basically their behavior changes so that they become more compliant with the expectation of how they handle information responsibly. But the second thing is, if there is somebody who is not doing that, or if you have doubts about somebody's behavior, you can now for the first time identify a lot of data, how somebody's behaving, that you can identify potential misbehavior, and you can prove irregular data accesses. So I compare UI logging a little bit to a speed camera waiting for a reckless driver on the street. If he knows there is a speed camera, he will keep to the speed limit and nothing happens. If he still speeds by, he would be faced with questions from the police who have a nice snapshot of what he did, and he better have a very good reason to explain what he did. Otherwise, well, he will have to carry the sanctions. From a schematic overview, when we talk about UI logging, we firstly talk about the standard system where you have a round trip from the UI, from the user, requesting data from the system. Works through DIMPRO processor business logic. Data are being retrieved from the database, are being processed back, and again land in the DIMPRO processor where they're being prepared for being shown to the user. It's exactly in the DIMPRO processor where our functionality works. First, consider UI masking. After the request, we do nothing with masking. It's only at the point before data being sent out to the user, we check which are the data that are to be shown. Based on the configuration and bodies we allow in this area, we apply masking or not. We can write a short trace of who tried to access what or got access to what. And the masked data, if it's being masked, is being played back into the stream, which then moves forward to the user and his UI. Now, if you look at logging, we have a twofold approach. First of all, directly after the request from the user comes in, we do the first logging of the request. So basically the input parameters, selection criteria, the functionality triggered from the UI, that can all be logged. After that, again, we do nothing in the business logic or database layer. And after UI masking runs through as a last step, before the data are really being shown to the user, we do a logging of the system output, and together with the input, this observed data traffic is being stored primarily or initially synchronously on your productive system for performance reasons. You do not really want to drop or lose any data because of a non-existing RC functionality to another system. So we do that really in the system. But to my knowledge, all of our customers have defined jobs that take this temporary log and shove it over to another area, to a repository where the data can be handled efficiently and also cost efficiently, and also the analysis is being supported because, well, you potentially pile up bigger amounts of data that you want to analyze with appropriate performance. With the log analyzer, we provide in this area. And that's basically a set of filters by which you can sift through the huge pile of data. And of course, such a tool, the better the questions you can ask. So after some research, you come up with very good questions, what you want to know, the more specific answers are. We have other ways as well from the temporary log. So directly when the data are being written initially synchronously, we are capable of triggering alerts within the SAP alerting framework. We will see that later in the demo scenario. And both the temporary log as well as the log storage are being integrated with, or are currently integrated with, enterprise threat detection and a separate SAP offering based on HANA, which is basically a SIEM system, a security incident event management system that can trigger particular actions based on the information that come in real time or near real time. But ETD promises on top to run statistical analysis and detect patterns, which are predefined by SAP, and based also on aggregations, find out statistical outliers and bring these to the notion if they are deemed security critical. So that promises to be much more than just an on-the-fly SIEM system. That would be me from the initial overview. I would then give you an idea of the systems. First, UI masking. When you talk about UI masking, we are masking out particular fields in systems. For instance, in SAP GUI, of course, as well as in Fiori screens. And that must, of course, be a coherent exercise. We will see that in the demo scenario in a second as well. Of course, we are capable of also masking in SC16, SC11, other table display transactions, as well as the appropriate output from these areas. That much. Let's open a demo system. So this is our test system. And just imagine me being an ordinary user. I'm in the area of HR. I try to access some HR data. I'm going to the transaction where I can look at a master data of employees, of my colleagues, and info type 8 stands for a basic payment information. I go in here in change mode. Now you see somebody was already active and has masked out some values which apparently were deemed security critical. Whether it makes sense or not, it's just an example. We can generically address any single field in this transaction as well as in other transactions. What you see is that somebody has, for instance, masked the amount of the monthly wage. This is as an amount field. By default, we mask out the complete length of the field with stars. The same thing applies to date fields. But in case of other fields where you have strings, for instance, like in the name field, we are capable of defining which digit is to be masked by which character. And as I said, it's completely generic. In order to get such a masking running in your system, so for the implementation project, let's have a look how this works. First of all, if you want to mask something, you would have to know basically how to address it. So in the technical information, you find first of all the table name, field name. Now for our configuration, that's basically the key fields. In order to mask this particular field in the DIMPRO, so in this particular transaction, however, you would also technically need program name, screen number, and screen field. So with those 5 entities, it's fine. I can achieve a masking. Let's look how the entries look for this particular field, for this end date field. I'm going to the implementation guide, where you, after installing the add-on that is UI masking on also all of the UI logging products, you get a new configuration node. We are located in the area of Subnet Weaver. That's because we're technically based on Subnet Weaver. We are agnostic of your underlying database. We are agnostic of your underlying ECC. It's just relevant that you have a supported version of Subnet Weaver. And well, with both solutions, we support releases which are quite a couple of years old. For the latest functionality, however, you should be on a release that's roughly 1.5 years old. Otherwise, you may have to imply a couple of nodes to also bring you up to that level. Now, in the configuration node for masking for SAP GUI, there's also field mask for WebDIMPRO ABAP, and for Web Client UI would be, of course, in the area of the CRM. And for Fiori, we don't have it in this system, but in another one. But you would have one node for each of the masking channels that we offer. After basic settings, the main transaction is the actual definition of the masking scope. So all the fields which are deemed security sensitive. This being our test system, we have done a lot of tests. Now let's just look at the area of P008. In here we see that a couple of fields are being masked, and it's just the fields we have just seen masked in the screen in the transaction PA30. Now, for the field for the end date, if you jump in here, well, this is how our configuration looks. It's not very much information that we need, not a lot of things we can set, which is probably not required. Usually when you do an implementation, you would first of all identify, of course, which business objects are critical. This end date, for instance, or a bank account number. After that, you would have to identify at least all the table field combinations where this business object is located. So all the instances where the end date, for instance, is being used in tables. Enter for the configuration part, for the implementation part, those tables and fields. And from that point on, trigger a mask configuration. So that's where used, working in the background, brings up a list of the found occurrences, hopefully most, maybe even all of the occurrences in your system. You can mark these and generate the customizing in an automated fashion. These entries, I don't do this now, it may take a little bit too long, the system is pretty slow, but these entries would reflect in this sub-configuration screen for program and screen details. And in here, you see just one entry, which is the one that was responsible for masking the end date in the PA30 transaction. It's exactly the technical details and address that we have just seen in the F1 help in the other transaction. So that's all that's required in order to define the scope. The next thing you need to define is, of course, well, by default, as soon as a field is configured, it would be masked, or the value would be masked for all users in the system. Initially, at least, also for sub all users, is really everybody. Now, you need to identify, of course, who needs access to this transaction and define these exceptions. And these exceptions are being defined via a role. You can enter any name here, any string you like, as a role name. The important part is this keyhole must, of course, have a key. So the key exists and consists of a role of the identical name existing in the transaction PFCG, where you define your roles and authorizations. For this new role to be created, you can also reuse existing roles, and you can use different roles for each single field or lump different fields by groups. But in order to have access to the unmasked data, a user must have a direct line between his user and this role. So either directly being assigned to the role or being assigned to the role via cascading roles. So that's very important because it is a kind of a restrictive approach that comes from the fact that we say, well, security by default means it should be by default protected, and any exception must be specifically mentioned. Now that's, of course, a strong approach that some of our customers have come back to us with feedback. It's not really handleable. It's too much effort and work, and we run the risk that we are too restrictive. No problem in this area. At least we provide bodies as well that can be implemented in the in the implementation project. Basically, it allows for entering all kind of logic. Who should be allowed under what circumstances to access a certain data object? We see that many of our customers use this. Implementations of each body do not take very long. There's a lot of information attributes available in the background of the screen. It's very easy to get them and to set up such a logic. So it's mainly attributes of the accessing user, but mainly of the accessed data object. And if you can bring them into a relation with logic and say, in case A is identical to B, then masking or not masking, then that's basically how such a rule can easily be set up. So for instance, you could imagine a rule where, say, to stay with this example here, even though it makes not much sense, probably, but if I'm a German HR user and access a German employee's data, supposedly he is in my area of responsibility, so I have complete unmasked access to his data. While if I access the data of a Swiss employee, tricky, probably I'm not allowed, or I'm certainly not allowed. In any case, you can set up the body in such a way that, of course, when I'm in Germany and the data object being accessed is related to Switzerland or another country, then a masking should be applied to the most critical values. So that's something that can easily be set up. And as I said, you can have different roles and a different body for each of the single fields that you want to mask here. But of course, you can also group them. Now you've defined the scope of what is to be protected. You have defined who are the exceptional people who should have access. There is more to it. We can also set the feed access trace. We can write this trace every time somebody tries to access the field, whether it's shown masked or unmasked. You can also say never, I don't really mind, I don't need a trace. Or you can say we write the trace only in those cases where the field is being accessed in an unmasked fashion. So that's the most obvious, but maybe not the most commonly used one. We see that these traces are very small. They don't take up a lot of space. So most customers that we talk to actually say, well, we just initially at least want to have a trace of basically everything that happens. Then we have a complete list. And if anybody asks us, we can hand over the complete list and also show what was handed out only in a masked fashion. The masking control indicator here is just for switching this definition on or off. HR relevance is kind of an inbuilt dynamic scenario where you can say, if I'm the user and I'm looking at my own data, then I see this data unmasked. If I look at another person's data, I would see them masked. So that's an employee self-service scenario possibly. Of course, an HR person would be assigned to the role in this case and would have access to all data, objects, information in an unmasked fashion. Technically, we have two approaches to offer. We initially start with a conversion exit approach, which is something that you as customers can also do in your systems. Basically entails a slight modification in the process before output. You would need to append a table and reroute the data to be shown to the new column that you have appended. Very nice way, because with just one configuration setting, you can address multiple occurrences in different UI transactions and areas. However, it entails also strong drawbacks. Basically, it's a modification. Even though it's not severe, it would still trigger a flag when you do a system upgrade. you also have restrictions as to the objects you can address like this. F4 helps are out of reach, key fields are out of reach, a lot of other data objects in the UI are impossible to address with this approach. For that reason, we went to standard and aligned, and they provided hook points in the kernel of .NET They're proprietary for your masking. They're delivered with NetWeaver in the latest releases then, of course, or in the releases as of which they are relevant. That makes our functionality completely modification-free in these areas where we get the hook points. So then we are in an ongoing exchange with the standard and are still increasing the scope of what can be covered with hook points, which for GUI is almost already at 100%. The pattern you can also set up and define by yourself. For instance, you could say from position 1, you want to have 3 stars. That means as of position number 4, you would have an unmasked display again. Makes no sense for this particular field because it's a date field. But also you could override the masking pattern and define for each single position whether and how, with which character it shall be marked. So you have complete freedom here as long as you do not have a value, an amount field or a date field. Now that's basically all you need to know about the implementation. You see, it's not rocket science. However, it can of course be a little bit nitty-gritty because you need to potentially define a lot of different fields in the program and screen details. That's why we say thorough testing, or well, first of all, a good setup covering as many instances as possible is required, and then a very good testing, of course, preferably by somebody who knows the area and the requirements pretty well. You may have a strong team who can do that. You can also draw on a partner, a strong partner. Natuvian is one that we've worked together with in the past, a good track record, and we trust they can pull it off again. Now, the next thing I would like to show is just a short glimpse on the trace, how this looks. If you look at today's date and my user, for instance, then we should see a rather short list, not even a single field access. Yeah, of course, not in October. Today there should be something. We see that I accessed the same field twice. You see, we offer a timestamp, we offer an identification, that's the username and the IP address, and we offer the technical address of the field given. What we also offer, or basically we do not offer, is the field value. This is being empty for reasons of data privacy again, because potentially you can have scenarios where somebody's data were accessed in many ways, and a lot of fields are sensitive, but are being shown in clear, and you would have a trace here. So it would potentially be possible to identify a person based on the information here and assign specific sensitive data to them. That's something we basically think cannot be possible in a product from SAP in this area. So we are just indicating whether a field was shown in free or not. So if I'm authorized and I saw the clear value, I would see a fat X here. I only saw the masked value. That's why I don't see anything here. Free text is something you can fill with a body if you like, but also the field value. Of course, you would be able with the body to fill the field value again, potentially write the value that was shown in the screen, as well as a free text, the data object, the key field to which it belonged. That would give you a very clear idea, but you would run the risk that maybe some personally identifying information are here that can be puzzled back together and result in a certain person and her critical data being identified. So that's what the trace is. There's a lot of things that this trace isn't, and that's exactly where your logging comes to pass. But let me first jump back to my screens for a second in order to fill or finalize the part on your masking. Basically, what masking means for GDPR. One short disclaimer here. I am, of course, not entitled to give legal advice, and all the things we offer as a functionality can support you, but we do not, of course, guarantee that if you do A, B, and C, you will be running compliant. That said, however, what we think such a functionality like UR masking does, just by the way it works, is it restricts data access. And in a very soft way, you can say this helps or supports requirements as to privacy by default, where you say, well, by default, data are being masked out. And only when somebody has specific access, then you would have those fields shown in clear. It's also by design because you set up your IT system in such a way, you design it in such a way that data are being protected as much as possible and can be applied with your business processes. So limit down the amount of data being shown to a single person, limit down the amount of persons who can see a particular specific piece of information. What you can also say is by suppressing field values on the UI level, first of all, of course, you bring about a certain level. If you do this in a well-established way and your configurations are right, you establish some kind of pseudonymization or anonymization, because this is also possible in SE16 tables. Basically, when you define a field to be masked for a table, it means the complete column is being masked in the fashion applied. With the bodies, we have seen it in the previous PowerPoint slide. It's also possible to identify specific cases where data should be masked and where not. And in a table display, of course, it would mean that some of the fields are masked, others are not masked. So that's all possible. That means by applying such a logic, such a masking to a database table, you would potentially be allowed to allow more users to look at database tables, where the normal SAP stance is that this should not be done in productive systems, of course. Realistically, we know it happens in the world outside. But this way of treating data, of anonymizing data sets, can also mean that you can allow users to create an output from the system and continue using this because the data, the personally identifying information, is being anonymized. You have masked out the name, the address, the birth date, the sex, and other things that would allow tracing back a certain person. And you just have business information in there that can be used, for instance, for statistical analysis of how much money a certain user group or a certain country generates. So if you establish that well, we see a lot of potential also in compliant cross-border data transfers. We have also had customers which have sold out their IT maintenance department overseas, and then ran into the problem that these overseas employees, of course, were not allowed to see much of the data, jeopardizing the complete deal, the complete business case of selling out the IT maintenance. And by applying your masking for the sensitive fields, they now think they can do this. So workers overseas, outside of Europe, can do the first, second level support, and only in those cases that can't be solved overseas and where somebody must have a closer look, then those cases are being handed back over to Europe, where they can be processed further, so they can still realize the biggest part of the business case of selling out the maintenance department. That just as an example. Now that brings me to UI logging. As I said, UI logging is a little bit like the speed camera. What happens, or what is a process, is that while data being accessed, a protocol is being written of what happens. At the same time, or near real time, an alert can be created and sent automatically, and we will have a look in how the structure of the log file looks and what is specific about it. Plus also, just as I'm mentioning, there's multiple ways of analyzing, for instance, integrating against other external systems. SIEM systems would spring to mind, but also SAP's enterprise threat detection, where we have a pre-established integration available. With that, I'm jumping into my UI logging test system, which is a different one. So in this system, imagine we do a very similar thing. First of all, we access a transaction in order to see data. Similar scenario, we access P820 display data. We look at person number 1 and the info type, again, number 8 for the basic payment, and go in here in display mode. Now, as an HR user, I just access the data and I have complete access to the data yeah, no masking is available in this system, but the logging is active in background, and there is a nice trace, a nice log of what I have done. Now, the first thing I want to show you, and just need to retrieve this, there is an email that was just created and sent to my account. So timestamp from just now, that the user ID Calato right now has accessed the salary data of this particular employee. So it's completely aligned with the SAP alerting framework. You can define how such a message may look. It's either a text-based or it's HTML-based, where the name of the employee, for instance, is dynamic based on what I've accessed. So that would be something, if you have a predefined thing that if that happens in the system, you think this is suspicious, you have defined that, you have set up this kind of Springtrap, you would get a heads up every time such a thing happens. So of course, if you set up the most interesting or most critical things, you would have a nice idea whenever something happens, whenever you may want to start looking into your system, what is actually going on right now. The other thing, of course, if you set up too much and set this up too widely, you're drowning in a flood of alerts. So there is also the question, what is really critical? How far do you want to go here? But it's a very good way of getting of the log file starting to talk to you instead of you having to go into the log file every time you think there may be something interesting going on, but you never know. Now, let's look at the data that we're generating. I'm just looking at my data from today, what I have accessed. You see there's a couple of things I did already. Based on the timestamp, you see I did it at 22:03 and a little bit later, and again now. Each of these lines is one round trip, so one action from me resulting into an output from the system back to me. So let's look what I have done. On the left-hand side, as I said, it's basically header information with a lot of data. We will see that in a better fashion soon. And on the right-hand side, more details. If you go over here, you see things like the host name in the log record. So that's my computer name. A technical user who is doing the analysis would probably use that one because it's quick and faster. But it's more intuitive maybe to look at a special display scenario for these data. Now, please do not regard the transfer. This is just because of the transaction I triggered to see these data, but we usually start with the header. After a header, we add a lot of metadata for this particular data access. There's an ID for each occurrence that is being logged. There's a timestamp. We see what is being logged, so that's the name of the transaction and the transaction code. We see my name and my client IP. We see again the host name, my computer name. We see which system, which client is being used. We see the platform, 10 standing for SAP GUI, 20 for WebDIM Pro ABAP, and so on and so forth. In some areas, we have multiple technical channels that we cover, for instance, for business warehouse access. 10 here again would then stand for BEX, 20 for BEX, for WebI, for instance, and so on and so forth. The reason ID and retention date is something we have just implemented. It's still not configured. It's very fresh. Basically, this is our that's our take at what a solution like URLogging needs to do in order to be GDPR compliant or allow you to run GDPR compliant. Because basically, we say we create a log file that can replicate sensitive information. You must have a very good business reason to do this that you define for yourself. In this case, probably it is because you want to adhere to GDPR. For that, you need to have a snapshot of what data accesses are happening. So that would be a reason. And there could be multiple different reason IDs to that, depending on the case. Most importantly, you would also assign a certain validity date with such an access that would result into a retention date or an expiry date that would also be standing here. And in the implementation, you would set up a job that periodically runs over the log file and deletes all the records which are out of the expiry or are already expired because you do not have a reason to keep this information anymore. And by that, you are documenting why you are keeping data, how you're keeping them, and also how long you want to keep them. Now, for the input section, usually here you would see the input that was triggered. In this case, I noted a problem with the system before. At least we should see the personal number 1 and the info type 8. It's currently not being logged. I'm not really sure why. I'll have to ask my development. But what you see is, what is the more important thing, at least from a direct perspective, it's the output. So you see for the screen that I've accessed with all the salary information of Christian Schubert, all the fields which were shown on the screen are reflected in this technical log. May look a bit confusing, but imagine or look at basically each entry. So these are all name value pairs. So each line is one name. This name is being a concatenation of the technical address, more or less, of this field, very similar to what we have seen before for masking. It's a unique identifier for this particular UI field in this particular system. And after that, after the equal sign, you see the value which was shown in this field. And by that, you have an extremely detailed possibility of tracing back and filtering down for data. Now you may say, and rightfully so, I do not need all this data, and especially I do not want to replicate my sensitive information here. It's not required to see in this log that this base salary is 1,700 something euros. So that should be suppressed. And you're very right. Also, you're right because suppressing data from being logged, of course, being protocoled or being taken out of the protocol at a certain point during processing means that your overall size of the log file would decrease. Now that's a very important thing. Just consider how we are setting up or we are configuring UI logging. So what you are doing is basically you define on transaction level what is your logging scope. So in order to log everything that's existing within PA20, you say, I want to log PA20. It's that simple. You transport that through your systems, and as soon as it's in the productive system, you have a logging for all the people who are also activated for logging. We'll come to that in a second. Now that's everything that can be technically logged. But we also, of course, we are generating a recording of what is available in such a transaction. So you would see all the views that are available in such a transaction. You can exclude particular views if you say, well, it's not interesting or it's not relevant. There's no specific sensitive information here. Moreover, in each view, we have all the fields which are being masked here. And you have a bit more of options in this area. Again, you have the program and the field name as the result of the concatenation of the before. Now you can go and say, I want to substitute the field name. Basically, when you talk about bank account information, that comes from different tables fields. And each of these occurrences in a UI, you can override the actual technical name with a string bank account. That means when you do an analysis and look for bank account, you find all the occurrences where somebody addressed a bank account field and not just a particular one in a specific transaction. On top of that, you can say, that field, I'm not interested, or I don't want to have it in the log file explicitly. You can completely exclude it. So this particular line will be omitted from the log file when it's being created. You can substitute also the field value. For whatever reason, you can mask it out. You can, of course, replace it with any other value you would like to have. You can add a descriptor in order also, to give a second level of retrieving, finding data. You can say, I want to keep the line and I want to keep the name. So I have a proof that the output occurred. However, I want to take out the value because that's data critical. I don't want to have this explicitly replicated into the log file. And last but not least, you can encrypt each of these lines if you say, I want to have it, but it's really data protection critical. I want to encrypt it so that somebody who accesses the log file from outside, however this may be possible, but whoever accesses this field would find an encrypted value and can't do anything with it. It can only be decrypted with the right authorizations within the analysis tool of UI logging. So that's our take at how potentially you can decrease the scope of what is explicitly being logged, of the amount of data you need to store, and also the magnitude of data you need to identify or analyze when you are looking for something. You can strongly decrease the scope of what you are storing, what your systems and what your people need to handle. That said, one last word on how users are being identified. We have a logic where you define at the beginning of your implementation project whether you want to have an inclusion or an exclusion logic. Inclusion logic meaning that per default, nobody would be subject to logging. Only when a person or a role or a user group, a profile is being explicitly mentioned, then all those people are being added to the scope. You can also then maintain exception users, people who are part of a profile that is subject to logging, but for instance, that people is of the Workers' Council and should be able to browse data without leaving a trace because they have the right to do so, or for any other reason. You can enter specific users who are to be excluded from logging, even though they usually would be subject to logging. Now you can also set up an exclusion logic, meaning that everybody would be logged in the areas that are defined for logging. And then you define specific profiles, groups, users who are exempt from the logging. Except then, if, again, of course, exception users, even though they would be exempt because they're specifically named as exception, they will be logged. So that's a rather, yeah, I wouldn't say coarse, but it's, yeah, it's a logic that is very simple, and we have made the experience that it's pretty good to handle, and most customers are quite happy with it. However, of course, if that is not sufficient, there's parties in this area where you can define your own logic of who should be logged under which circumstances. That said, I would end my presentation and quickly jump back to the slides to wrap it up. Now, what we have just seen in the system, what this means for GDPR is, I see UI logging as a kind of a game changer here. The setup we have, the coherence by which we cover the most important SAP UI technologies and can log data access and bring together this information in a way that is analyzable, and the fact that we are logging everything that was actually really accessed makes this log file extremely strong. It's extremely rich. So you have a very good baseline of a protocol of data access, who did what, when. You also see how people got there, so you can also interpret the why. It may make a huge difference if a user hopped and double-clicked through transactions and it's all part of his normal workflow. And at one instance, he did a double-click and came to the screen where a particular sensitive value stood, but he immediately jumped out again because apparently he misclicked. So yes, the sensitive value was displayed, but no, you would not think that he did this on purpose, and you do not think that he would actually be a data thief. Well, if somebody downloads a huge table via SE16 and a lot of information is there which is data protection relevant, that's a different thing, probably, that is a bit shady. But with this information that we provide here and also the analysis options, we think that UI logging is positioned to uniquely support the requirement of the 72-hour breach notification. Simply imagine if you have a data breach or the idea that maybe something happened. Now what happens? The DPO and his team are supposed to find out within shortest time, is this something that I need to notify the authorities of? Or you need very good information already to make such a decision. After you made the decision, yes, there's something shady, I must report, then the stipulations are that you, of course, also give an idea to the authorities what happened exactly. So the data objects, which types of information were jeopardized, and also the persons, the individuals who are probably involved in the, who are as data objects, who are victim to a potential data theft. The next question, of course, will then be who did it, and that's also something that's not stipulated directly in the protection regulations. But of course, if you have a chance to find out who who did what, and identify a potential data abuser, you can stop him in the system. That's why we say UI logging is probably the best way to go at the 72-hour notification requirement, simply because there is no other log that is so integrated and so coherent and really based on access only in a very specific way. A data protection officer would have a very hard time with the normal system logs that are ubiquitous, but he would need to bring together different logs in order to make some interpretations. And with UI logging, he sees this a lot more directly. And of course, the second benefit I mentioned before, that as soon as people know that their movements, that the accesses can be traced, can be protocoled, their behavior changes, so you can expect that a certain portion of dubious data accesses would just vanish and not happen anymore. And that's also, I think, or from my perspective, I would expect that in case of a data leak, if an organization can show we have done a lot here, this is a state-of-the-art, maybe best-in-class protection. We have put in place all the stuff. We have told our users that they can be logged. Then you can also expect that, you have done quite a lot in order to, by design and by default, minimize data accesses. So that's a more soft KPI, but it's something also where UI logging can be tremendously helpful. To finally wrap it up, the question is, how can you make use of this? And here I talk of the 10 channels. We offer UI logging for a variety of 6 different UI technologies or interface technologies: SAP GUI, Web Pro, Web Client UI as SAP legacy stuff, where I, however, think they will have a much prolonged lifetime also in the future, and UI5 Fiori as SAP's strategic UI technology of the future. With logging, we also cover technical interfaces. I mentioned before, RFC, BAPIs, web services, as well as business warehouse access. For your masking, a similar scope with the exception of the technical interfaces. That's simply for the fact that we do not or have not built this in a way for customers that we would be willing or able to productize at this point. We know what needs to be done in order to do that, but there's no product available for this today. We can offer that as a project, of course. Now, each of the hooks you see here basically is one license you can acquire if you want to protect SAP GUI with logging. It's one license. If you want to protect SAP GUI with logging and masking, it's 2 different licenses, and so on and so forth. For the implementation, that's a very important part. Again, here Natuvion is available for services. We think it takes like usually 25, maybe 30 days for each of the licenses to be ready to go live of implementation effort. Test effort comes on top, usually is in a similar area, maybe a little bit less. Of course, if required, SAP also offers implementation support. However, with a strong system integrator and partner like Natuvion, this would not be required. Anyway, the goal should be that also you build resources in-house who can, at a later point, maybe do small changes by themselves, who have an understanding of the functionality. And in case your scope changes and you just want to change a little bit, one additional field for masking or logging, that you can do that by yourself and don't have to set up a new project for such a simple thing. My final slide is the value proposition. Again, we see this as a strategic offering to cover the insider risk. So I just see that I translated parts to Jen already. That improves compliance and decreases your risk exposure. So the 2 streams, the 2 threats to data protection. Functionally, UI masking is unique functionality in SAP. There's nothing else in SAP. Nobody else who can do that except UI masking. UI logging is the premium offering in SAP for data access logging because of the wideness of scope. We cover basically everything in SAP GUI. We also cover business warehouse logging where no other functionality exists at all, and especially the implementation projects for UI logging can be expected to be a fraction of that of any other means to bring about a read access logging. Technically, we are strongly aligned with SAP standard. We have an ongoing collaboration here that makes our products extremely secure and performant, but also future-proof because, well, this functionality that enables us is available in the standard shipment of SAP Subnet Weaver, and will remain there. Also, the implementations you have seen by this way can be very, very quick. You get support basically from partners in the field, potentially also by the product team, as they're very quick to bring about. I see you're logging and masking as a certain quick win, and especially at a cost that probably far outranges the the cost is much lower than the risk that you protect with it. With that, I would be at the end. I'm open for questions, either now directly on the chat or also via mail, but I think Juliana will have a stance on that.
Thank you. Yeah, as Taria said, please submit your questions in the panel, and we will be happy to answer them. If not, after the webinar, we'll send out a recording and the slides, and if you have any further questions, just feel free to contact us. Thank you.